At some point,
we push nature aside
to make room for cities.
What were we thinking?
We aren't separate from nature.
Nature First Cities
calls for action to restore fragments of nature
to where we live,
so that these fragments
can evolve into networks
of re-emerging ecosystems.
Nature makes everyone healthier,
happier,
and reconnects us.
It makes density work
and stabilizes the climate.
Nature is the answer.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm so grateful for the invitation. We're literally gathered around the heart here to talk about Nature First Cities. Thank you also for the territorial acknowledgement. And I had an opportunity to look up some information about the Kwantlen Nation. And they state on their website that since time immemorial, we live by the 7 traditional laws that guided our ancestors: health, happiness, generations, generosity, humbleness, forgiveness, and understanding. I thought those were beautiful principles and a nice way to sort of set a tone for this evening as well. Huge thanks to Cheryl and James for organizing this event and inviting me out here. It's a real pleasure to join you. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors, Cam Brewer, who's has lived for a couple of decades, at least in this part of the world, but is now an environmental lawyer working in New York. And he's an adjunct professor at the School of Resource and Environmental Management at SFU as well. He teaches our environmental law classes. And also Herb Hammond, who's the founder of the Silva Forest Foundation and really one of the original architects of ecosystem-based planning, which the methodology with which infuses the book that I'll be talking about this evening. So they're both wonderful human beings and have been amazing collaborators to work with. So let's just jump in. Can everyone hear me okay at the back? All good? Projecting all right? Okay, so we have here a small scene. This is the Still Creek watershed, one of the primary case studies of the book. You can see sort of the ecological complexity that surrounds the creek. And I'm standing about 100 meters from a SkyTrain station, just to give you an idea of the urbanness that surrounds this little pocket of what we could call nature in the city. And while we poured a lot of research into the book to look at the impact of nature on people, what we gain when we invite it back into our lives and into our cities, what has happened when we have lost it. The one thing that we didn't come up with is whether or not it's possible to transfer biophilia, that innate sense of connectivity with nature that human beings feel in our genes and in our DNA from an evolutionary sense, whether that's possible to experience that through a CarPoint screen. But let's just say hypothetically that it is possible. And what I can tell you that as a result of seeing that small scene of sort of a more natural environment, that you're actually all feeling a little more relaxed. You're feeling a little less stressed out. The beer might be helping with that too. And importantly also for where we're at as a society and as a global society, you're actually more tolerant of your neighbors, more convivial towards your neighbors. So it's an extraordinarily important concept and also feeling that human beings experience when we are surrounded by nature. And as you can see from this picture of an old growth forest section that Herb took, the wilder that nature is, the better the outcomes for people. The higher health impacts in terms of lowering our cortisol levels, to say nothing of the cleaner air that we breathe, the moderating temperatures both in the summer and the winter that nature provides us, and that we can bring that experience back into the city. That was really one of the primary goals of the book, is to try to recreate that sense of connection and connectivity between human beings and nature, something that we've really lost in terms of how we've developed our cities. And that experience be something that is common to all people, that there's a real component and a strong driver of equity in how we approach this and bring this type of wildness and this type of nature back into the cities, so that it's an experience that everyone can have and not simply sort of a wealthy few, for example, that might live in greener neighborhoods. And at the moment, our greener neighborhoods do track very strongly with higher income levels. So this is something that we have to tackle across the entire city. And it occurred to me the other day while I was on a run with my dog. This is Trout Lake Park in East Vancouver, near where I live. And I was running along and navigating dozens of people taking pictures of the leaves. It was actually I was like, geez, like it was like, trying not to catch anyone with the leash. And then as I got sort of past that emotion, trying not to take anyone out, I was struck by the fact that we feel this sense of connectivity to nature, right? We all feel a sense of awe when we experience natural beauty. And that could be the leaves changing in the fall, the first snowfall, even the extent to which humanity and human beings just seem to freak out every time like there's a solar eclipse or something, right? Like we get excited about and have that sense of awe and that sense of biophilia that is really common to all of us. And it can be something as simple as looking at the leaves changing. And as we will look at over the course of this talks, things getting more complex as we start to think about bringing nature of ecological significance back into our cities. But we all, I think, have that point of connectivity. Okay, so let's get into the why in the first part of the talk. I want to start off with kids and children's playgrounds. I grew up in the forests of North Vancouver, which I think impacted my own sense of connectivity to the natural world and sense of commitment to the natural world, something at the root that we are trying to reconnect with the stories and the messages of this book. Those forests were turned into primarily single-family homes, large single-family lot homes with some condos and townhouses. But what we know is that when children play in these types of, this looks like you're in prison, doesn't it? Like, don't get out. When children play in these types of hard infrastructure manufactured playgrounds, it's physical prowess that tends to dominate in terms of how they interact with each other. Whereas this sort of much more natural playground setting, the emotions and feelings and experience that children have in those settings are creativity and collaboration. And there's studies that really back that up. And you can guess which qualities the world is in greater need of. So there's also a phenomenon known as nature deficit disorder, which some of you may have heard about, right? Which is literally a clinical disorder that is being associated with children who are completely removed from any sort of natural surrounding, right? Higher stress levels, higher levels of cortisol, more challenges regulating their emotions. So this matters really at a really fundamental level in terms of our kids. Yet despite the importance of nature, hello, glad you come. Despite the importance of nature to ourselves, to people, to human beings, we've really developed in a Western colonial sense, cities and human settlements which have largely eradicated nature from our environments. And this loss affects us deeply. It affects us at a personal level, at a community level. It affects our children at a really fundamental level. And in an age of climate change, and the increasing severity of climate change, we're going to experience our third atmospheric river tonight over the last couple of weeks. It's going to cost us dearly. And so we are being presented with a choice, and we do still have a choice. We can make really fundamental differences in terms of how we build our cities, how we build our communities, and importantly also for the long-term implications of the methodology that were associated with this book, which is going to be measured in terms of 100 years. Everything that we do now will matter. So we have a choice about whether we would like the cost to be borne in terms of flood damage and fire restoration work, displacement of people, and so on, and the health impacts that are coming with climate change in terms of increased heat and things like that, or it will cost us in terms of creating more livable, more equitable, healthier, and more resilient communities and cities. So we have a choice. It's going to cost us either way. It's just a matter of how we wish to spend our dollars, and more importantly also, who is going to be spending those dollars. Are we transferring essentially the public wealth of the environment, of intact ecosystems into private hands, or do we maintain those benefits and reconstruct and restore those benefits for the benefit of all people who live on our citizens and communities. So those are some of the choices that confront us as we look about implementing some of the ideas that we have outlined in this book. Where did the problem come from? Well, it goes right to the very root of how we have conceptualized cities from the very get-go. You could go back further in terms of the separation of the human mind from the natural world and so on. But from an urban planning perspective, I'll highlight a couple of things, which Henry Ford noted that we shall solve the city problem by leaving the city. So the city problem being one of industrialization, poor planning, of health impacts, and so on to people that live there. So the idea was, okay, well, that's what the city is. That's what human settlements look like. So we're just going to, on the weekends, we're just going to get out of here. Or if you're wealthy enough, you'll just leave. And nature was something that was somewhere else. It was out there, right? So aside from sort of the inequity of that particular solution, we also don't want the 4 billion people currently living in human settlements to sort of just leave every shit, right? And stomping over the natural environment. So nature is something that, from the conceptualization, the very root of how we thought about our human settlements, was something that was out there. Similarly, also, Robert Moses, who was talking about building parks in New York City, and he confronted a similar problem. He's like, okay, I want to create some parks in New York City, but you know what is really annoying? There are people in the way. Right, and there's this quote that he has, which is that these cities were filled with people with their endlessly intertwined, hopelessly snarled tangles of aspirations and antagonisms, hopes and fears, dreams and dreads. Right, so I mean, maybe that's a good depiction of just about any community. But again, here we see this connection above what green space was, right, and how we were going to build parks, which was by largely displacing people who already lived there. So again, we see that fundamental separation of nature from people. And that's what they did. They displaced a lot of people to create some of the parks that people to this day, in fact, are enjoying, but nevertheless created this sort of fundamental understanding about how we build cities, which was largely devoid of nature. So the impact of these philosophies rooted in our Western sort of colonial relationship with nature is really the problem that we're trying to overcome. And at the root of that is building a sense of connectivity back to nature that I talked about at the beginning, but also thinking about within our urban form, how can we reconstruct nature back into the cities that we've already built from ourselves. If we look a little closer to home, this is archival footage taken in the Lower Mainland. This is about 150, 175 years ago. This is how settlers created space for development on unceded Indigenous lands. It's an approach to planning that we are still using today, maybe with fewer explosives. We use, bulldozers and those types of things now, but generally, you could just see we're going to take it all. And then build the city on top of that. This is how we treated our town and city waterways. They were impediments to urban development. They was a scientific approach to building hard infrastructure that we could basically just culvert them, put them under the underground, and carry on with no real consideration for their larger role in the ecosystem. This is, we're living with the byproducts, some of the legacies of this decision making in terms of some of the flooding that we're experiencing in the region and around the world. There were also health reasons for doing this at the time. Like they were thinking about creating space for human settlements and sanitation systems. But at the time when we were piping rivers and streams throughout the Lower Mainland here, we knew enough to know better. But again, nature was out there. The species that were very present in these ecosystems were non-consequential because I guess there's just enough out there, and biodiversity is not something that we connect with in urban form. Certainly there were no sort of ecologists present working for cities at the time saying, hey, you know what, maybe we don't want to do this, right? So again, separation of nature from cities. This is what the impact has been. This is sort of closer into sort of the Vancouver bordering on New Westminster. What you see basically is just we lost all of these urban stream systems, the salmon runs that were associated with them. And it's costing us greatly in terms of the hard infrastructure costs, infrastructure that is now seriously being degraded all across the country. And it got a little bit better as we moved east, as urban development sort of moved east, right? This sort of caught up to the fact that maybe actually getting rid of all those streams was not the best idea. But nevertheless, it is a problem and something that we are going to have to deal with. I've talked a lot about sort of nature and the ecological costs, the ecological benefits. But if that is not, and James, you're talking about more of the economic connections to strong towns, which is extremely vital and super important. This is also a significant infrastructure challenge, right? So you use the example of trees and the cost benefits of having an urban tree strategy. That type of thinking is really starting to take off because we face significant challenges. That this is the water main in Calgary that burst just a couple of months ago that basically threatened the water supply. This is flooding at the base of Still Creek. That's Montreal. And this picture up here is actually part of the pipe infrastructure taken out of the ground in Prince Rupert, right? So this is both an urban and a rural challenge. And the mayor took this piece of pipe. You could see how just incredibly, it's just full of holes, right? The leakage that they had in their system was extraordinary. And he put that piece of pipe on the table right in front of the council. So if people came in to sort of meet with mayor and council, they had to look over this rusty pipe to make their point. And it was sort of, this is why we're ripping up the roads to replace this. This is why we're trying to, they're actually currently piloting a wetland, stormwater, and wastewater management treatment system that they're hoping will be more cost effective and work for their water management needs. So this is a phenomenon which is right across the country, right across the Western world for that matter. And city managers are now starting to pay much more attention to it because they're looking at millions and collectively billions of dollars of infrastructure deficit. Ripping up pipe in the system, reculverting it costs $1 million a block. It's extremely expensive. Yeah, so that this is a phenomenon that is affecting pretty much every community. It's an extraordinarily costly problem, and nature can be part of the solution here as well. It can intercept rainfall, filter runoff, hold moisture in the winter, release it during the summer, stabilize shorelines. That's another issue that's coming up majorly for us here on the coast in terms of sea level rise associated with climate change. What are the natural solutions, natural infrastructure solutions to dealing with sea level rise? So there's lots and lots of work going on all over the country, in fact. But we are still kind of at that pilot phase, right? So this is a picture of our rain garden system in East Vancouver, close to where I live. These systems, and there's a couple of systems in East Vancouver, made the news after the last atmospheric river because they worked, right? Everyone was super excited, right? They performed. They're beyond their design specifications, helped to mediate some of the water flow that would have normally flooded certain parts of the city. So overall, a great news story. It's beautiful. It's integrated with active transportation. These are really great possible solutions and cost-effective solutions, but we need thousands of them, not the occasional pilot project. So that's the scale of the task that is confronting all of us. The other aspect of this, which is inviting nature home into the urban areas, is 80% of Canadians live in urban areas, and there are significant ecological hotspot zones where we live, right? So over 1 billion people around the world live in the top 25 biological hotspots on Earth. So this is, as we approach sort of the biodiversity crisis, as we approach the crisis of climate change, cities have to be part of that solution. Not just simply because that's where people live. There's a responsibility to do that everywhere and not just out in resource regions, but because many of those cities and many of the urban habitats that we've created for ourselves are actually biological hotspot zones. So when Herb, Cam, and myself are talking about inviting nature home, it's, that's sort of a gentle way of putting it, but in many respects, from a health perspective, from a cost perspective, from an ecological perspective, really that's sort of the connectivity between and reliance of human beings on nature. It's actually a necessity. It's not a nice to have, it's a necessity. Density comes up. Density is one of the core principles of achieving this for our cities. Do we need to prioritize density? The answer to that is absolutely yes. It's how we actually create or save space for green space and green space restoration. It is the most effective strategy for dealing with the climate emergency in terms of allowing transit, making communities walkable, reducing energy use. So density really has to be one of the core principles that we talk about this. The key is really how to make it work together. How do you sort of combine nature with density? And to that, we turned in the book, we learned a lot from Majora Carter. She's an environmental and community activist in the South Bronx area in New York City. And she was really explaining to us the restoration work that went into the waterfront in the South Bronx. And really that it's nature that makes the density in that neighborhood work. It has to be woven throughout all of our communities, as I had said at the very beginning. And in terms of really enjoying the sort of the potential for that restoration work in our higher density areas. Equally also, our concern in the South Bronx area, for example, was not that it was really challenging conceptions of low-income neighborhoods, right? And also challenging the conception that gentrification will lead to displacement, right? If we make neighborhoods nice, they'll gentrify, prices will go up, and then people will become displaced, which is a very real concern. But the type of ecological connectivity that we're talking about in this book, that other cities are entertaining, means that the nature has to be everywhere. It can't just be sort of in pockets. That connectivity, the ecological significance, the way that it becomes significant and meaningful from a biodiversity perspective, means that it has to be absolutely everywhere. As Majora Carter told us, she said, I'm not afraid of people in my community. I'm not afraid that people in my community will get used to quality. I'm counting on it. And we can support this type of restoration work with other policies around affordable housing, protecting certain economic zones, for example, that can reduce the consequences associated with traditional gentrification as a result of an increased green space. How much green space do we need? We took a shot at it in the book. The late Harvard biologist, ecologist E.O. Wilson estimated that at least half of the planet needs to be devoted to nature if we're to avoid ecological collapse. So we thought that was a good number, 50%. They're very scientific, right? And how do we do that in cities, right? That's the challenge. You saw some of the pictures of some of the sprawl and some of the urban inner city cores that I showed just a minute ago. 25% of urban areas are taken up by buildings. So covering these buildings with green roofs, for example, green walls, this is a Patrick Blanc installation in Paris, could get us part of the way there. 25% of our cities are dedicated to the streets, which represents another opportunity. This is a picture of a restored and removed highway roadway in Seoul, Korea. And if we start thinking about restoring natural river systems, many of the ones that are underground, that will take us another part of the way. Suddenly, you start chipping away at realizing a 50% target. Okay, so how do we do this? The methodology that we articulate in the book is called nature-directed stewardship. And it's a term that is inspired by the traditional approach to resource region planning called ecosystem-based conservation planning. Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, Herb Hammond was really one of the architects of that philosophy and worked with other scientists and ecologists around the world to develop it. So the key thing with nature-directed stewardship, like its sort of original source in sort of rural resource regions, is the first question that you ask is not what you could take, not what you can develop. Don't look at a piece of land and think, okay, we can develop this much, this is something, No. The starting point for the conversation is what actually needs to be maintained. What do we have to keep on the ground in order to preserve ecosystem functioning? And once you have sorted that out, then you engage in the development conversation. People and communities and economies are fully a part of nature-directed stewardship. They have to be. But we're just sort of flipping the traditional sort of Western industrial concept of development on its head by asking, okay, what should we preserve? What should we protect? And in cities that are already built up, what should we restore? And how do we go about doing that? So it's a completely different way to approach development, but one that we're going to have to be really serious about going forward if we're going to deal with some of the challenges that are coming forward. So what are some of these concepts? And this is where I'm a planner, not an ecologist. So I'm tiptoe out into the ecology aspects of this that Herb provided. If there are ecologists in the room, please shout out or say that's not right. So one of the founding core principles that we cover in the book first is to understand natural character, right? So natural character is basically what the ecosystem looked like before the city was here. And you can sort of reconstruct that through, okay, well, for our case study in Still Creek, similarly to here, it's a western hemlock rainforest. These were managed landscapes for thousands of years by indigenous peoples, but that maintained ecosystem functioning. So we're not talking necessarily about pristine environments, but managed environments that had all of the functions and characteristics of intact ecosystems. So the natural character is the starting point. What did it look like? How can we sort of visualize what it used to look like? And that is also a matter of what the composition is. So, what were the pieces? How are they arranged in structure, and how did they function, right? So those are the ecological principles that underlie how we are going to identify what to protect and what to restore. The other part of this is to understand the next step in the process is to understand the condition. So the condition is, well, okay, we have this sense from understanding sort of what a coastal temperate rainforest would look like. We have a sense of, through stories and oral histories, what that would have looked like. That includes both indigenous knowledge holders and also early settlers. And I'll talk about how so that played a role in us doing this work in Still Creek and on Vancouver Island. So the next part is the condition. Well, what does it look like now? Right? So in the Still Creek example that I'll be showing you in a minute, it's 80% impermeable surfaces. And that's a significant barrier to overcome, right? This is why the water just hits the ground and whoosh, it's gone, right? We need to slow every single drop of water down from cloud to culvert, right? And the way that we've constructed our cities, the being completely, almost entirely devoid of natural systems means that water just hits the pavement and whoosh, it's gone and causes problems like this. I remember meeting Herb after one of his field days. So we brought Herb down and he sort of did field study walks all over the neighborhood, all of the sort of the urban watershed. And, the first day after he'd spent like 8 hours wandering out the city and the neighborhood is just like, oh my God, so much pavement. So much pavement. So, that was one of the things that we had to really wrestle with. So 81% impermeable surfaces, 5% urban forests, which is not a huge number, but at least it's something to work with. 11% other vegetation, 3% gravel, skytree, and other marginally permeable areas. So that was what the condition of this urban watershed looked like. And it's probably very similar to what a lot of other urban watersheds would look like because it's fully developed. So condition is the next piece of the puzzle. Are there ecologists in the room? How am I doing? Pretty good? Oh, nice. Okay, I got a thumbs up there. That's good. I'll keep rolling them. So this is what the nature-directed stewardship process looks like, and I'll bring up another chart in a minute. So do you understand the character of the ecosystem? You know what it used to look like. And that is critically important also because it will allow you in. We don't have endless budgets, right? And this is going to take a long time to do. So if you understand the natural character, you're going to be able to identify the important areas as well. So what parts of the city, if we're going to prioritize restoration work, should we focus on? And if we have sort of remnant sort of patches, whether that's parks or school grounds or whatever it happens to be, riparian areas, let's protect those. Let's really prioritize those because those anchors can become part of what is going to be constructed into an ecological network. So what is the character? Describe the condition of the ecosystem, and then what you end up there is with, if you're talking urban, fully urbanized areas, is a significant gap, right? So that's your restoration gap, essentially. So once you've done that, then you're, you create the boundaries for human activities, in housing, for example, or economic activity. Figure out what that's going to look like in multiple spatial scales. It's another problem with how we've sort of developed cities in the Western sense is we just look at everything like a site, right? It's like, well, here's the, you go to those meetings, it's like just the block or just this particular chunk, and it's not, there's no sense of connectivity to the larger scale. And then after that, you actually, you get on and do the work. The multiple scale piece is extraordinarily important. So thinking about this methodology all the way from the site level into protected networks, working your way up at the regional level into sort of larger territories. So there's ways to create connectivity with this methodology across scale, which is extraordinarily important. One of the other pieces that was sort of the light bulb moment for a lot of the community people that we were working with is that acknowledging that they live in a watershed. We're standing in a watershed right now, right? We've lost that sense of connectivity or a sense of conceptualization in cities and built up areas that we are actually still part of a watershed. And that is a really important piece as well, because I'll talk about the importance of water in a second. So what does that look like when you start to understand the natural character? You start to get a sense from looking at the ground where your sort of ecological hotspots could be, and then what you have to work with. And that's where you can start to construct networks of ecological reserves. And this is sort of, again, this helps planners to think longer term about, okay, so we know this particular area is super important, right? They're unlikely to go in with a bulldozer and just start ripping things apart. But what they can do is, create different development standards and development permits for how development could take place in that area. They can think really long term, which is if a building comes up for sale, do we want to purchase it, right? So a lot of cities are creating sort of a restoration budget, right? Which is both going to help them deal with sort of managed retreat from sea level rise, but also things like park expansion, greenway expansion, things like that. So if we have a sense of where we want to put this, you can punch that in the computer at City Hall, and every time there's an opportunity to do something right there, you know about it, right? And that's where the long-term thinking really comes in on the plan. As we zoom in here a little bit more, you can start to get a picture of, here's the creek and the waterway. We have sort of green space over here, but we could potentially connect it up to here. This has been proven to be important from a water movement perspective. So again, you start to sort of really construct what this could look like on the ground. Zoom in one more piece here, which also, that's a lot of pavement, right? It's in their buildings. This is an industrial zone. What is that going to look like in terms of restoring this? If we've identified that this is an important ecological zone, how does it work? I talked about the importance of water a second ago. So this is another concept that was really critical to the methodology, which is understanding the water movement network. A lot of that water is under the ground, right? So we don't, it takes a lot of work to try to reconstruct what that's going to look like in an area, as you're saying, in Surrey, which still has intact salmon bearing stream. It's an easier project, but no less important in terms of prioritizing that the connection in terms of where water is, how it's flowing, and high biodiversity value is extraordinarily important. So this water movement network is a huge part of the story as well. I noticed in terms of looking at some of the plans that you have out here in Langley, in the township of Langley, that you are also thinking about water movement network, right? And passing different environmentally sensitive area zones associated with your riparian areas and your stream systems. I think that the difference, or where we're trying to move in terms of thinking about watershed scale planning, is not just sort of the 5 meters or whatever your buffer zone is on either side, but actually thinking about the entire watershed. So what does development look like out here, which is actually affecting the runoff going into the river, right? So that's where the permeability is a challenge. That's where some of the protection and ecological rezoning has to take place, because all of that water right now is just going to hit the pavement, hit the river, and flush out any life that might exist in the stream. But it was really neat to see that in your plans, because you're obviously thinking about the same thing already. What does this look like in residential zones? We have sort of a current condition and then sort of conceptualization of what it could look like with enhanced density, right? If you create zones for density, you're not necessarily displacing people, or you're accommodating more people within the space that you have. But there's lots of work to do that you can do in terms of urban tree forest strategies, for example, green roofs, engaging citizens in thinking very differently about their own private property on their land. How much variability, how much are you creating with the plant species that you are planting? Things like permeable dips in the roadway, restored, creek beds. There's lots of ideas that are out there that can help us to achieve better ecological outcomes in our settled areas. This is what it looks like in industrial place. So this is sort of a zoom in of that same industrial park zone that I talked about before. Here again, you see a sort of a tree management strategy, green roofs, some restoration work, increased permeable surfaces, and then gradually, if this is identified as a particularly hot ecological zone, you could think about restoring this entire area. We also did a case study of Shawnigan Lake on Vancouver Island. So this just to sort of give a sort of urban-rural fringe example. And obviously the main difference that you have in a place like Shawnigan Lake, despite the fact that it's growing like crazy, is you have more green space to work with, right? So you're not spurting from, wow, that's 81% concrete, let's get going. You're started from a place where there's quite, while the planning has been low density, right? So this is, again, that sort of forethought about, wow, this is a really beautiful place to be. I wonder if people are going to want to live here. Yes, they are. So, that's part of the challenge, right? So thinking differently about the type of density that they're going to allow in this area. But the key difference, of course, being that you've got more green space to work with. You're not sort of starting from a lot of concrete and prioritizing that green space so that if you've got it, it's super precious. Right? Hang on to it because it's going to be extraordinarily critical going forward in the future for protecting biodiversity, for mitigating the impacts of climate change, and just creating more livable, healthy, equitable communities. So this is another conceptualization of the nature-directed stewardship model. Again, identify the natural character. Think about where you have existing fragments or anchors of green space and ecosystems, wetlands, park systems, natural systems, whatever. Restore fragments and anchors. So prioritize where you're going to spend your dollars on your restoration budget and let the water movement network guide how you're going to prioritize that work. That then creates your restoration network and your protected network. So that's the ecology part of the methodology associated with nature-directed stewardship. So I wanted to, the third part here is the how, really, right? So the book, we articulate the how really as a three-part process. And what that means is that it's going to involve collective work of the scientific, indigenous ecological knowledge and residents, right? People that know their place, know their communities. More and more cities have ecologists working on there as part of their planning staff, which is a wonderful trend to see. We need more of that. So that's a huge part. Residents and communities have to be engaged in this conversation, right? You think about the percentage of land that is private land. That has to be part of this restoration work. And then as we start to scale up from sort of, private lands to blocks, to communities, to watersheds, local and senior governments have huge roles to play in doing the type of planning, the long-range planning, and investment that's going to be necessary to create this change. If we take a look a little closer to and start telling a little bit more of the story of the case study, this is Still Creek. There are salmon. I think there might still be some salmon there, but the salmon run has been going through. That's part of why we chose it. The salmon came back to this stream that has been sort of restored in bits and pieces over the years. And the fact that the salmon came back was this sort of really wonderful testament that, they thought it was worthy enough to come back. That they're not sure it's an established salmon run yet. It might just sort of be strays that are finding their way into the river system, but it's becoming an annual thing that everyone generally freaks out about, right? Because you're sitting behind a Canadian Tire somewhere staring at salmon spawning in the middle of the city. It's not something that people, particularly in this part of the city, are used to, and this part of the region. So again, I was talking about that sort of place knowledge and historical knowledge of these places, and the Still Moon Arts Society, which is the community organization that we worked with in partnership on the project, they have gathered historical evidence. They've sort of looked at the archives and gathered oral storytelling They work with Indigenous knowledge holders who are familiar with the area to understand what the ecosystem used to look like. Again, trying to get an understanding of that natural character that I talked about just a minute ago. And one of the settlers, this was in around 1800s, I've lost my space in my notes, but around 1800, and it was described as a paradise of a place, right? So it must have looked a little bit different than it does now. But within this case study of Still Creek, it provided us with an opportunity to understand, how we've treated nature, what we've lost, but also the potential that exists when we bring it back. The fact that planners didn't and city officials did not value nature translated into how neighbors and citizens treated it as well. It became basically a garbage pit for things that people didn't want to have to bother taking out to the transfer station. Stillmoon has worked tirelessly to remove the trash, remove the garbage. They're engaged in the annual blackberry battle to cut back the blackberry and plant sort of more native species, and engaged in the ecological restoration work that is so critical to bringing this back. The great part also is this is the citizen engagement part, right? That we're not going to make progress here if people don't feel that connection and value to nature, right, within our communities. So Stillmoon is an arts organization that's deeply involved in ecology, so they use art as a way to animate the space, to get people out, to build that sense of neighborliness and community. This is one of their projects. I love it. They also hold an annual Stillmoon Festival where kids make lanterns and there's music, and they walk the ravine with all their lit lanterns. Again, just animating the space, moving it from something that neighbors think is dark and scary into this sort of beautiful realization of a natural space and what an incredibly precious thing it is to have within such a developed urban environment. There's amazing citizen science going on right around all over the region, right? There's lots of coordination now taking place between different stream keepers organizations, so they're all sort of collecting similar data points, and it's giving us really valuable information about what's happening in the region, right? If we're engaged in all this restoration work, how do we know if it's making a difference? And, water quality and the species that are sort of coming back into these streams is one way of doing that. Other community groups are getting involved in, infrastructure projects. This is a community group in North Vancouver that has got permission to build a rain garden in a parking lot that was prone to flooding. So lots of really neat things going on all over the region at the community scale. The other part of that three-part process is involving cities, right? So given the scale of the challenge, given that the core connectivity to the importance of density, cities, local governments, local planners have to be involved in this process. They're going to create the policies, the programs, the incentives that are going to make this possible on the ground. And also the larger restoration parts, right? So these creating larger restoration zones. This is one right near sort of the terminal near the Ironworkers Memorial Bridge, which was a massive restoration project to help bring the stream back. One of the great pleasures and privileges of putting the book together was an opportunity to look about what's happening all over the world. Right? We connected with scientists and researchers and planners, urban ecologists, landscape architects in different parts of the world that were writing about really cool case examples. This is a local example. This is Port Moody. They are about to launch their first natural asset management strategy, right? So that's a city planning way about talking about natural character, essentially, right? So, it's 2024, and we have, major cities doing that for the first time, right? So that's a wonderfully positive step. I mentioned Surrey has a biodiversity conservation strategy. This is a really cool project in Melbourne. We got to learn about doing a lot of stream restoration work and involving citizens in sort of recreating biodiversity. And the picture on the far side of the scale there is from Durban, South Africa, and they are also involved in a really fascinating biodiversity rejuvenation project linked with at a regional level with lots of different ACMs. So, despite the fact that our cities face massive challenges and Herb's realization that there's a whole lot of concrete out there, there are people, there are landscape architects, ecologists, planners, citizens, activists who have been really promoting good things for years and years and years. We can learn a lot from them. So finally, just some final thoughts for you before we get into sort of the discussion part of the evening. First of all, we know enough, right? Everything that, all this sort of the vision that I've articulated here around what a nature first city could look like is all possible. These are not sort of far-flung, unproven technologies and concepts and approaches. These are all tested and possible. So the barrier that we have in terms of cities adopting these practices is one more of education, training, and awareness, and sharing stories amongst each other. It's not a technical problem. Secondly, perfectionism is the enemy of the good. This is a picture of me delivering a sustainability workshop in Saskatchewan. I flew into the airport and they said, "Oh, we're terribly sorry, your car's not available, but good news, we'll upgrade you to the Hummer for free." So I got to drive into this region of Saskatchewan, part of the province where they could see it coming from about 100 miles away. And everyone knew that I was the person driving the Hummer talking about sustainability. So, we all got to start from somewhere. People are going to be at different places, different knowledge bases, different sort of ways that they constructed their lives. So, perfectionism truly is the enemy of good. There's lots of things that we can do, lots of low-hanging fruit that we can do to get started and to build momentum. The third piece is inspired by Jane Jacobs. In 2004, she penned a piece called "The Greening in the City." And she states that perhaps it will be the city that reawakens our understanding and appreciation of nature, something that is counterintuitive to the way that we built our cities to this time, right? With nature out there, nature other. So we would like to make these words prophetic, but move beyond thinking about nature as green space or greening, and talk about nature in terms of ecological significance within our cities. 175 years ago, we literally blasted nature from our cities. And the book documents what we've lost in that process, but also what we have to gain as we start to invite it back home. And the final piece is nature is the answer, right? It's just sort of extraordinary when we were thinking about ways to communicate the core ideas of the book, when you start looking at health, when you start looking at equity, when you start looking at sociability and connectedness, and loneliness, when you start looking at air quality, when you start looking at heat, when you start looking at water and stormwater management, nature is the answer to all of those challenges. It's absolutely extraordinary when you get a chance to put it all together. So nature really is the answer. And, we have no illusion that this is a short-term fix or it's not going to be challenging. Right? Some of the things that we're talking about here are cultural, right? It's not a technical problem, it's a cultural issue, right? In terms of building that connectivity and that sense of value with nature. And as a cultural issue, it's going to take a long time to shift, right? It's the sort of grinding work of education and outreach and, things that you're all doing as part of your organization here in Strong Towns Langley to raise awareness and build that innate sense of fascination and awe that we have with nature back into the cities. So, we're optimistic that as these things start to be built and restored, it creates its own momentum, right? City managers will appreciate cost effectiveness. Citizens enjoy living in these environments. Again, if we put it everywhere, it helps with the equity dimensions in terms of how our cities are building and evolving, and so on and so on. And hopefully that momentum will build to the point where the cultural change is not so grinding and slow. So thank you very much. Again, thank you for the invitation. I didn't bring out copies of the book, but if you are interested in having a look at it, UBC Crest has a discount right now for coinciding with the launch of the book. So if you're interested, you can go there to grab a copy, and that's my email address there. I'm super happy to chat with anyone or share information with any of you, if there's particular ideas here that you like. So thank you so much for being here and coming out on a Tuesday evening to talk about these really important ideas.
Thanks very much. It was really helpful, enlightening, and optimistic. Here in Langley, we're a little bit different than some of the examples that you gave, which is that a lot of Langley still has forest on.
Yeah.
And I can think of at least 3 examples in the last 5 years, maybe in the last 2 years actually, where a subdevelopment has come in, approved by the township, and they basically raised the site and then put houses on it. So that seems like a 40, 50 years ago sort of approach, but I think that's still happening all over North America. So we're in a situation where we actually still have salmon streams, we still have forests. We're not necessarily we have to be in a restoration, we have to be in a preservation. And I was wondering if you have any examples of cities where they've actually said to a developer or an approach where it's like, there's a forest on this property. We know it's private property, but we'd like you to design this subdevelopment where most of that forest, 30 to 40% of it, that's mature forest, remains, and you build around it. Because I think there's a lot of people in Langley who like see more of that.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, with your global perspective, if you can think of any situations where cities are actually doing that.
Yeah, I mean, again, that the Shawnee Lake example is maybe a little bit more informative on that, right? Because you have the green space left, right? So the part of that is to just have a fundamental understanding of that ecosystem, on the ground, right? What that looks like, how important it is, right? So if you have those intact forest systems or riparian areas, they are absolutely precious. So to understand the value of them first and foremost, and to understand where you could build versus where not. And then what you're really talking about is sort of development standards and design guidelines that then influence how developers are going to go in, and if you're going to build housing, which is great, how are you going to do that? So, I mean, there are examples in the region where you have higher design standards. Portland, for example, and they're one of the driving forces. Actually, we're seeing, saw some really creative things actually in Alberta, believe it or not. And one of the driving forces behind that has been water scarcity, right? So it's not so much about being sustainable or whatever else. It's how we're treating water, which is creating a whole different set of design guidelines for how cities are developing the density, the type of intact green space that they're leaving behind, dealing with stormwater management and things like that. So those are areas where we're probably seeing more sort of better outcomes in terms of justifying more stringent environmental design guidelines. But there are examples out there. Sort of the key question is, what's the motivation driving the decision making? And at this point, it didn't seem so much to be, well, in certain places it would be, but it didn't seem so much to be around ecological conservation, but dealing with some of the problems that getting rid of it all creates. And also the density, right? You see all those studies, I mean, they want to do that because it's easier, right? You just bulldoze it and build it. There's not people that already live there. There's not sites that have to be sort of either restored or heritage components that have to be preserved, right? It's just cheaper and easier to do. But again, as it started at the top, and there's a cost associated with that, right? And we saw a really visceral example of that in Southern Ontario with the proposal to infringe upon the Greenbelt, which thankfully created a lot of pushback. Right? And that ecological zone just delivers millions and millions and millions of dollars of benefit to that region in all types of ways. But there will be those out there who are, never waste a crisis in terms of the housing problem that we have, using it as an excuse to sort of go in and build really bad housing. So we have to be, really diligent about that.
Thank you very much. I've considered a lot of different aspects of this, and you talk about culture and the ecological aspects, but the monetization of the environment, I think, is something that's really a key consideration. Oftentimes, I think it's very persuasive, and we're talking about different communities that have incorporated that. And I know Gidsons, for example, did that. where they created a watershed understanding of what the wetlands did there. So they had a way to evaluate that. Do you have any kind of comments about that and what kind of frameworks are best to be able to figure that out?
Absolutely. I mean, it's another point of motivation, right? Another entryway to sort of thinking differently about this. Some people bristle at the monetization or thinking about nature as in a monetary or capital firm, which is fine also. But where we're seeing some really neat innovation is incorporating, considering these areas as natural assets, and then incorporating it into the infrastructure budget of cities. It's fabulous, right? And Gibson's was a real pioneer in doing that. And there's ecological accounting frameworks now that help you cost these things out. Again, it's not rocket science. We have good examples and good measures for, understanding. You have an option. The pipe that I was showing you in Prince Rupert, you have an option. You can. They're faced with a guideline that they're no longer able to just flush everything right into the ocean by, I think, 2029 or 2030. Not a target they're likely to meet. So their options were a $300 million hard gray infrastructure treatment plant, or a series of 3 plants, I believe, down on the waterfront. So you're disrupting the waterfront. You are pouring a lot of concrete, very carbon intensive. And it's about the projection that they were throwing around was $300 billion, which is cost prohibitive, obviously, for a town of that size. But they were interesting. I was talking to Cheryl about this in the beginning. That thing that they were more concerned with is that we're not going to be able to attract the type of people to live here that we need to work in the plant. So for them, it was a human capacity challenge. So they're engaged in a pilot program to create a wetland system of integrated wastewater management treatment, and it's about a third of the cost. So that's very appealing. And they can then count it as part of their infrastructure budget, maintain it as part of their infrastructure budget. So we need more examples like that. There's a lot of interest up in northern BC about it because a lot of small and indigenous communities are facing degraded infrastructure that we all built very enthusiastically in the 1950s, for example, and it's all coming to its end of life at the same time. So it's a massive economic problem, and these natural systems can help in that, in addition to delivering this cascading other types of benefits that are talked about. So yeah, it's a great example.
Sorry, just one more comment, because you made a good point about the fact a lot of our infrastructure is very aging, and so we're building more, but we have to keep advancing, repairing or replacing it. And so the aspect of using nature to do that is something that's very cost effective, but we don't seem to do the kind of economics that takes the totality of all those costs together.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and there's important considerations there. Like when these systems were first being introduced, like there's an engineer somewhere with a pen in their hand going, I have to sign off on this. Right? I have to have confidence that this system is going to work. Not only for my own reputation, but it's costly, and there might be citizen health implications, right? So we have to know these systems work, right? So there is. I'm not underplaying the technical challenge that is associated with these, but the good news is that providing these systems work. There's lots of them all over the place. It's an easier ask, obviously, when you're talking about wetland conservation, for example, in the outskirts of the city, either in terms of mediating water flow and things like that. So there's, some things get more challenging, but the accountants are catching up, I guess, which is good news. Yeah.
One of the things you've not commented on is the pressure of the speculator development composite of the society. And in Surrey, they are constantly asking for variances on whatever might be the provisions in the official community plan, biodiversity conservation strategy. That which is paramount appears to be transportation and roads. Yeah, we're losing all of what you've been talking about.
Yeah. No, it's I know all those pressures exist in Surrey. I think they have some really great plans and they have some really great policies. It's the constant vigilance that's necessary, like the type of groups that you're a part of here. It's the education challenge in terms of understanding what we're losing. I talked at the beginning about that transfer of public wealth into private hands, which is a huge part of the problem lately. And then the other dimension of that, we have a history in Canada where we like compromise, right? So we have green space. We're like, well, actually, you know what? We'll just take 20% of this, and we'll develop it, but the rest will be protected.
Oh, the developer's myth.
Yeah.
Which is there will be a balance.
Yeah, it'll be great, and we'll get development, but then, and then a little time goes by, and people forget, right? And there's another concept called shifting baseline syndrome, which is people don't understand how the environment is changing from one generation or even shorter to the next. So they look around and think, oh, this is natural, this is normal, right? And then someone comes along 10 years later, you know what? Actually, so we're just going to take 20%. But, we're going to conserve the other part. And then we just keep chipping away at it till it's gone. And then you get to the point where it's like, okay, we're going to take the rest of it, but we're going to create a green part over there, which has lesser ecological value. So, that system of sort of just constantly grinding away with, developers, for example, that can have very long time horizons associated with their investment capital. It's vigilance, it's good policy on the ground to protect these things and development standards. And it's a huge challenge, particularly where we are facing housing crises.
I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the fragmented nature of municipalities in the Lower Mainland. I think something that we're talking about a little bit now is here, Surrey has different policies. It kind of needs an excuse of well, if Surrey isn't going to do X, Y, and Z, then why should Township of Langley do X, Y, or Z? I wonder if you see a path forward from that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the regional planning is the answer there, and we have livable region plans that extend over into this side of the river. Every city, including your OCP here in Langley and Township, has to have a statement of how it aligns with that livable growth strategy. So, at a staff level, I think there's lots of really cool things happening, with staff within different municipalities. There can actually be a sense of competitiveness, I found. And when we were working with on the Still Creek case study, we had to work with Vancouver, Burnaby, and New Westminster, basically following the stream on its pathway out to the Fraser River, right? The stream doesn't care that there's a municipal matter. And, it was sort of interesting encountering the different cultures that were associated with managing the stream at different parts. And there was also a little bit of pushback. It's because he'd be like, well, Vancouver's doing this. And they're like, ooh, Vancouver's doing this. Don't tell. We don't want to be like Vancouver. We want to, So there was that sort of that tension that existed as well, which I think could be a positive thing, right? Is if we're that policy transference idea where we get people that are involved in these issues together and they start talking to each other and showing up at the same conference, sharing how they're doing things. I think that's the pathway forward because it is a fragmented system. There is a regional plan, but it's a plan of influence. It's not directive, right? So I would place more of my faith in the stat level in trying to create that network and how important that is, right? That's also something we don't normally fund, right? The social capital and the connectivity between people to be able to go to conferences and meet and just why do you need budget for a roundtable meeting? Well, we're just going to talk about how we're treating the environment. Well, is that really worth our money? Those types of things can be hard to fund and then hard to sustain. But that's the kind of work that's necessary. Do you have good examples or?
No. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, it's great question for sure.
I actually have a question as well. Yeah. Is there any provincial legislation that you would like to see that could help push these ideas forward?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of the green infrastructure funding, I think is a really big piece of it. We've seen good examples of it in the past. A portion of the gas tax, for example, used to go to create sustainability plans for communities and things like that. So different levels of senior government, provincial and federal, obviously, I think have to come to the table to support the financing and the funding, particularly for the larger projects. There's also, from the riparian perspective, federal jurisdiction, right? You drop a fish in the middle of a stream in the middle of the city, suddenly it's a federal issue, right? So that whole concept of the water movement network and really integrating that conceptually with city planning is a barrier that I think we could get better at doing. And then also conservation, right? There could be a role for particularly the province, for example, in terms of protecting some of the areas that are really critical, remaining habitat zones and biodiversity zones that we have left in our cities. So lots of roles. That's that three-part process where that they have to be at the table to make this work for sure. Yeah.
On my experience, I used to work for a couple of different municipalities, and I found that developers would sometimes hire the least professional QEPs, the least professional QEPs. And at first, the province was not. We'd tell and at risk of losing our jobs from senior management, we'd go to the province and say, don't accept this wrapper report. It's missing creeks, it's mischaracterizing creeks, and then the province got a bit more funding and hire a few more people in the rapid program, and that's riparian area protection regulation, and then they actually started going after these QEPs, and that made a huge difference in my municipality. And these QEPs sort of disappeared, and they got fined.
Yeah.
And some with developers and engineers associated got fined as well. Engineers on the developer side, and so yeah, the professional reliance. I don't know if you've encountered that, but it just seemed like it was such an important part of how the system should be working.
But yeah, great example, right? Good regulations. The professional reliance piece is critical, right, in terms of how that's regulated and monitored.
Yeah, look, it's also as a lead up to staff to behave professionally, and even when they're being told by their bosses, and that can go up to council, not to question the developer, because we got told that as well. The developer's QEP is saying this, do not question it, even though we knew it was wrong. And it's wrong for professional staff to not abide by their professional standards.
Right.
So I just think that's
good example of the pressure, right? The pressure that gets created for sure. Yeah.
A nature educator in the public school system. I teach outdoor kindergarten. And I really work on the side of promoting the biophilia and trying to push back against the nature deficit disorder with my students. And I, like many of us in this room, probably grew up with a big backyard and access to nature that helped promote that connection that we felt, and being a part of nature and is so important. And it seems like it's being vilified now, of course, with population pressures to have a single family home with a backyard and a tree in a garden for every child to develop that sense of connection as a young person. And I just see that with the monetization of ecosystem functions, that we're forgetting that people, children especially, need access to the nature that we're creating in our denser cities. It's not enough just to have street trees. It's not enough just to have a riparian zone with high fences. It's not enough to have a retention pond fenced off for safety, and playing fields and hard structures for children to recreate and people to recreate, adults too. We all need actual safe access, public access to move through and interact with our natural systems. So I'm just wondering if you have examples or suggestions for who is working on this access to nature piece.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the work that Majora Carter has done was really informative for us. Nature is what makes the density work. Was an expression also that North Americans live in our houses and Europeans live in their cities, right? So that's a transferring of how we think about the natural space that we have to create for ourselves when we're in denser urban environments, and how that makes us feel and how kids interact in that area. So it's a huge part of driving the motivation for this type of work. I think, just in the last number of years, like the pandemic really exposed the preciousness of those parks and natural area systems for people in terms of walkways and you get outside and sit outside. It was a value attached to that, I think, that was unknown previously. So, the work that you're doing is so critical. To your point, it's these systems and these greenways and these corridors and these points of connection can create that type of space for everyone. And it doesn't have to be someone's backyard. People be able to step outside of whatever dwelling they're in and have a more authentic experience
with nature and the wild, all the better. So it's huge for,
I wonder if you could tell me, if you look at the township of Langley, do you think of it as a city, or do you think of it as I do, as a urban and rural municipality that has both of those aspects? Because I don't personally think of it as a city, and I find that when people come from outside of the municipality to speak about environmental issues, they quite often refer to what I think of as natural/rural areas as being an urban area. And I think it distorts outsiders thinking about what is actually happening in the AMA.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm in along the core of my work is actually a rural and small town planning. And my answer to that, you can get all statistical if you want about population levels and density and distance to metropolitan zones and so on. But when I do work and research and work with communities, I generally ask them, do you think of yourself as a rural community? And if the answer to that is yes, then it opens up all other kinds of possibilities. Or a connect place, care for the natural environment, interactivity with the natural environment, perhaps a different level of connection to different resource sectors and how those sectors are managed and integrated into the natural environment or not. I think the starting point is how communities envision themselves, and then building the connectivity back to why the conservation of nature, the appropriation of nature into infrastructure systems can be part of the solution for communities like that as well. But not necessarily to give rural places a pass because they don't have the same density pressures, for example, that they don't also have a commitment to sustainability, to reducing the greenhouse effects, to creating and preserving more green space through increased density and things like that. So it can be a different and challenging conversation in more rural areas, but also lots of points of gateways into having a really good conversation about the value of nature and how much people value it. Yeah. So you see as a more rural landscape or more rural.
Well, it's obvious if you surveyed the township that it's urban and rural. There used to be language on the township website, I don't know if it's still there, that spoke about there being an urban and rural balance. But the unspoken reality is that the urban part continues to eat the rural and semi-rural areas. And that's where you talk about density. And I feel like density as a vocabulary and as a way of thinking, which in many ways, that kind of thinking came out of us talking about preventing urban sprawl. And in the practical reality of Langley, when somebody's talking about density, they're not talking, it's been weaponized for urban sprawl. And there's an unreality to so many of the conversations that we have because of that, because we're not talking about densifying areas that are already quote unquote urban. We're talking about spreading out and densifying areas that in many cases have natural spaces. Yeah. So that's why I have somewhat of a frustration when we have people from various conservation groups or outsiders of town of Langley and they come speak about trying to conserve a specific area, but they refer to it as an urban area. And I just kind of like, okay, right, not worth arguing about, but
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a different conversation, right? And a different opportunity in terms of maybe degree of some of the green space and intact systems that are still there. Density is a form of sprawl. Is a really love how you put that, because it's not being planned. It's not being planned with any sense of natural asset management. Maybe it is, I don't know, but there's no sense of what the philosophies in this book of understanding what you need to protect first, and then designing your communities and your economies around that, because it necessarily sounds like that's not happening all throughout the region, right? We're still building in poor ways, letting that happen. Thanks, James. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate it. Great question. Hey, thank you.